Hi guys, welcome back to the workshop. Today what we're going to look at is getting started cutting wood, plywood, that type of material, and what to look out for with your first saw. As regards the saws, we've two here on the bench today. One is a jigsaw and the other is a circular saw. And what we'll do is we'll go through each, look at their features, how to mount blades, how to operate them, and then we'll do a rough comparison then of where one might be more suitable for you over the other. Now, the first saw that we look at in detail is the jigsaw. I'll just hold up the plate there so you can see it. It's a 400 watt motor and it operates with up to 3,000 movements or reciprocations a minute, which is quite fast. From a power point of view, a 400 watt motor is plenty. Obviously, if you're getting into bigger material like 4, 5, 6 inch material, which it is possible to cut with the jigsaw, obviously then you'll see a degradation in performance. Now, to go through the various parts, battery slots in the back here. Next up then is an on-off switch here. This is a variable speed switch, which I'd recommend that if you are looking at getting a jigsaw that you get one with a variable speed switch on it. It makes life much handier when you're starting a cut, just to be able to maybe nick a piece of material first and then progress in at full speed. The general recommendation is that you go through a cut at full speed of the saw. Next on top then is a little safety lockout mechanism whereby you can prevent accidental starts. If we look around this side of the jigsaw here, what we have is a little button here. And what that button does is it allows some diversion of the airflow from the motor to blow out underneath the base plate here and blow the sawdust away from the cut. A handy feature. Around the other side then, what we have here is a switch, and this switch controls the aggressiveness of the cut into the material. So when it's down like this, the blade just goes up and down with no other movement than that. As you go up through the grades there, the blade will go up and down and it'll also cycle. At the front of the saw then is a quick release mechanism to drop out the blade. These here, and I'll hold it up, these here are called T-bar shanks, and they have become the industry standard as regards jigsaw blade mounting. If you do come across a different manufacturer, a different style of mounting system, I'd nearly recommend that you avoid it because you're going to be tied into that particular manufacturer. So tools themselves generally will have different mounting mechanisms. This is reasonably straightforward. You pull up the little handle here, you slot this in here the right way around, and that should sit into a guide then here, a little roller guide just underneath the blade. Okay, so once you have that in security, you're good to go. When it comes to the rear of the machine, we have two features here. Number one is a little socket there for accepting a dust outlet port that you can connect to a vacuum cleaner or some type of dust extraction mechanism. And above that then we have a little handle here. When we move that handle to the side and we move our bottom plate forward, we can then rotate the bottom plate to create an angled cut, which is called a bevel. And you can do that either way on most saws, and there's little angle markers there to tell you what angle you're at. So we'll put that back to flat. It should sort of detente into it. Push that back in, and then we close our little handle at the back to lock it back into that 90-degree or flat position. This saw itself came with a little plastic clip-on plate, and that sort of clips on, slots in like that. And what that does, it gives you sort of a protective layer on the bottom plate for when you're dealing with particularly soft or sensitive materials to scratching. Next then, in terms of features, is if we look up at the front of the saw here, now whether we'll be able to do it or not, there's little holes here just in front of the blade, and you can fix a fence into it. Basically what a fence is just a guide to keep you straight as you're running down a length of wood. This saw itself didn't come with a fence, it has to be purchased separately. But this is what the fence would look like. It's from a different saw, so it doesn't actually fit into the slots. I'll demonstrate the fence on the circular saw when I do that. Now, before we actually move on to making cuts, what I'd like to go through is the selection of blades that you can get for a jigsaw. Amongst others, you can get specific blades for ceramics, specific blades for PVC piping, cutting plastics, woods, metals, and in the metal section there's a number of different blades available for aluminium, steel, copper, etc, etc. And then in the wood category there's a very, very big selection of blades. I went out yesterday and I just bought 3 packets of blades, and I'll just show you the differences between these. They effectively look the same, they're sort of the same length, you know, to the casual eye they look very, very similar. So the first 2 I'm going to hold up here are effectively the same. But if you see there, the teeth on the blades are actually oriented differently. One set of blades cuts on the upstroke and the other set of blades cuts on the downstroke. And effectively what that does then is, as it's going through a piece of wood, the direction that the blade cuts in will break out some splinters. So if you wanted a clean cut in a panel that's facing you, what you'd look at there is a blade that's cutting away from you. So basically a blade that's cutting on the downstroke. Conversely then, if you wanted a clean cut on the far side of the cut or the bottom of the cut, you'd use a blade that cuts on the upstroke. In addition to that, you can cut various shapes with the jigsaw, you know, circular holes for piping or conduiting. And generally speaking, the blade itself will do that away fine. But there is limitations there as regards how tight a curve you can cut. This third set of blades then here, they're called coping blades. And what they are is they're thinner, they're more flexible. And what they do is allow you to cut a tighter radius. So if you have to cut some complicated curves or very small circles, coping blades are the answer to that. What you'll find is if you cut a very tight radius with a normal blade, the blade deflects, and what you'll get then is sort of a bevel that you don't want on the cut. And there's 2 ways of fixing that. Number 1, the coping blades, as I said, which are designed for making tighter radius turns. Or the second is, when you do make the cut, drill a hole in it first and cut it out like sections of a pie to give your blade room to maneuver inside the hole. Now what we have here, a piece of plywood, we're going to make a hole in it where we don't have access to the side of the material. So we'll just mark out a hole. Now this is about 3 inches or 75 mil. We'll just examine that. Yeah, just shy of 3 inches. Now this would be regarded as a hole that's too small to be able to turn the blade in the jigsaw. It's too tight a radius. And what will happen is that the saw or the blade will twist, and then it'll either vibrate a lot or it'll cut crooked, and it'll be a difficult cut. So what we do here with this is we have 2 choices. Either one, we swap over to one of these, which are the coping blades, or another way of doing it would be to etch it out by means of like eating sections of a pie. So what we'll do now is we'll drill a hole in the middle, enough to get our blade in, and we'll say what we'll do then is we'll cut in a pattern that's good enough that we can basically cut out sections of the pie. Now, as you can see there, not the prettiest of cuts, but it will allow you to open up this more or less circular fashion with a number of sort of segmented cuts. Now, my recommendation would be to use a coping saw or a hole saw for the likes of this. But if you're stuck with just a jigsaw, it will get you there. And you can always tidy up the hole when you've sort of the main sections of it cut out. What you will notice is as you progress through a turn with the blade that's not suitable, you'll get an awful lot of vibration, and you'll actually see the blade flexing and twisting, which obviously sort of means more vibration, and it also increases the risk of the blade breaking and coming off. Okay, so that's sort of a hack way of making a round hole where you don't have a coping blade or you don't have a hole saw to do it. In addition to the wood blades, I picked up 2 lots of metal blades. Sorry, before we move on, what you'll find there is that the blades for cutting metals are always HSS, which stands for high-speed steel, and then the wood ones, you'll see there just at the top of the packet there, it says HCS, which is high carbon steel. So just be aware of that if you see high carbon steel, it's generally a wood or softer material blade, and HSS then would be high speed steel, which is for cutting metal and stuff like that. These 2 sets of steel cutting or metal cutting blades I have here, one is 1 to 3 mil, which is basically up to an 1/8 of an inch, and then we have 3 to 15 mil, which is an 1/8 of an inch up to 5/8, I think. I'll stick that up on screen if I'm wrong. So what we'll do is we'll give these a go. One last thing now before we move on from blades is the same principles apply to jigsaw blades as they do to a hacksaw blade, reciprocating saw blade, and I'll stick a link down in the description below for a reciprocating saw video I did where I go through the blades, the tooth profiles, the teeth per inch, which is the TPI or the pitch of the blade, and various other blade related information. Okay, now what I have here is a piece of 6 mil steel, which is just shy of a 1/4 inch. I have a new blade, a new battery or a freshly charged battery in the jigsaw. I have the cut turned to no motion except up or down, and what we'll do is we'll just see how this gets on with this. The blade itself is 3 to 15 mil capability, which is an 1/8 of an inch up to 5/8. So we'll just see how we get on, and does it cut steel, you know, in some shape or form. So as we can see there, it does cut the steel. It's a very slow process and there's significant vibration, but if you are stuck to cut something, it will cut it for you. Now, it certainly wouldn't be my first choice of cutting steel. Now, the second saw we're looking at today is the circular saw. Effectively, what it is, battery at the back, switch, motor, and a blade then clamped at the front. This is a 6.5 inch, which is a 165 mil blade, and fairly straightforward to operate. Generally speaking, the circular saws don't come with a variable speed trigger, but there is a safety lockout mechanism there to stop accidental starts. So effectively what you do is you press down the little safety paddle and turn it on. Generally speaking as well, there should be an electric brake on these, or electronic brake, so it should stop instantly when you take your hand off or your finger off the trigger. As you can see there, it stops very, very quickly, which is important. To change the blade, it comes with an Allen key included. It slots in here at the back. On the top of the saw, there's a little button that you can depress here. That's the spindle lock. So we'll take out the battery first, so that we don't accidentally turn it on. We'll rotate the blade until we can press down the spindle lock. You'll feel it slot into place. And this is a left hand threaded nut or bolt here. Generally speaking, if the blade rotates clockwise, you'll have a left hand thread here. Okay, so we take this fella out. And what we'll do is we'll mount a new blade here altogether. for the purposes of demonstration later. There's a little flange sitting on top, which you'll see slots out. That's the flange there. We'll open up our new blade. Okay, blade is in. Wrong way around, like this. Generally speaking, you'll see an arrow either on the guard or on the body of the saw, and the teeth will cut in that direction. So as you can see here, these are the cutting tips of the teeth, and they must rotate this way. So we'll stick our flange on. Good. And then we'll stick our little bolt in. And again, we're doing this lefty tighty. So that's sort of snugged up there. We'll close the guard. We'll press down the spindle lock. And what we're looking to do is, again, go left to tighten it, because it's a left-hand thread. The purpose of the left-hand thread is that as the saw rotates, or the blade of the saw rotates, it should tighten the little bolt rather than loosen it. Right, we have our new blade in. The next features on this now that we'll look at, we've gone through the battery, the switch, the blade, how it's mounted, what size of blade goes in there. There's a guard here at the back, or at the bottom, and that sort of protects the blade, or protects you from the blade. As you progress into a cut, that guard should retract. Now sometimes they get a little bit stuck, and you might need to give it a little bit of a movement here to move it forward in a sheet of timber or a sheet of plywood or whatever. Now this saw can also cut at a bevel, and the way the bevel operates is there's a little tightening mechanism at the front. You loosen that, and if you can see here then, the bottom plate moves. It only moves in one direction up to about 45 degrees. So that's how you cut a bevel or an angled cut. On the rear of the saw then, just here is another little lever, and if we press that up, what we do then is we free up the bottom plate of the saw. So what we can do there is use that for two things. Number one, we can control the depth of the cut. So at its maximum opening, and we'll just tighten that there, you can see that the blade doesn't meet the material. So we can use this, and there's markings on the inside. I don't know how I'll show you this. They're just in here to show you the depth of cut, and it goes from the 2.5, or basically 2.25 inch depth of cut when the plate is fully up, down to 0 then. So you can use this, as I said, for controlling your depth of cut. And secondly as well, if you need to make a plunge cut, you can open this up, start the saw, and then drop the saw into a sheet, whereby you can actually go into the face of the sheet as well. Now the last feature I'll just show you is the cutting fence, or the ripping fence as it's called. There's two slots on the front of the saw, and this slots in, and there's a little button then to tighten that depending on where you want it. And what that'll do then is it'll guide you, or use that as a guide against the edge of the material to keep you straight as you cut down a sheet. Okay. Now what we have here is a 4 foot or 125 centimeter length of 3/4 inch 1920 millish plywood. And what we'll do is we'll just run a cut with both the circular saw first and then the jigsaw afterwards to compare times. I have the fence set up on the circular saw to keep me straight. We have a new blade in both the circular saw and the jigsaw, and we have a freshly charged 5 amp hour battery. So what we'll do now is we'll time these and just see what the comparison is as regards speed. Right, away we go. Now, as we can see from our comparison, the circular saw is much quicker as regards the rate of cut, but obviously is only limited to cutting in a straight line and is limited to cutting to the depth of the blade. In this particular instance, it's 50 mil or about 2 inches. So this is particularly suited to cutting sheets of plywood, 2x4s, etc, etc. The Jigsaw will cut the 2x4s. It'll cut the plywood, albeit slower. It'll cut a range of patterns, circles, triangles, whatever you need to cut. And it'll also provide cutting in a different range of materials that you can't get with the circular saw. So my recommendation to anybody starting out and looking to get into, you know, basic cutting of plywood, wood, tiles, maybe even metal if you have to, would definitely be to opt for the Jigsaw. It's way more flexible in terms of materials, blades, depth of cut, etc, etc. The only reason I'd see to get a circular saw is if you're doing a lot of sheeting or you're doing a lot of 2x4s for a construction job or something like that. From a homeowner's perspective or an occasional use perspective, the Jigsaw is going to do everything that this can. Some of it obviously slower, but it'll just give you way more in terms of flexibility. So that's my thoughts on circular saws versus jigsaws. Hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, stick them in the comments down the bottom and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, see ya.